We must be willing, individually and as a nation, to accept whatever sacrifices may be required of us. A people that values its privileges above its principles soon loses both. It is a way of life, more than a haven for the weary. It is a hope for the brave. This is the work that awaits us all, to be done with bravery, with charity, and with prayer to Almighty God.
Congressman Francis Payne Bolton, Eisenhower's friend and political confidant, took the president's admonition to heart. She never put privilege above principle. In 1940, she won Ohio's 22nd district and held it for the next 28 years. Mrs. Bolton was Ohio's first congresswoman.
I am Congressman Francis P. Bolton, again a candidate.
During her tenure in Congress, she helped to shape many of the defining moments of her era.
A nation is not a tangible thing. It is an echo of the past and a whisper from the future. The whole bound together with the lives, the hopes, the endeavors of millions of men and women. The strength of a nation is the morale of its people. And who is responsible for this morale if we are not, we women? Is this not a moment when we women of America must charge ourselves anew by taking upon us the burden of the responsibility to build strength in every area of our national life, with the certainty that only as we are strong can we serve the world's need of freedom.
To Francis Payne Bolton, our dream of freedom was symbolized by our American flag. She said, "What is the meaning of our flag? To me, it stands for a unified people. It has been a symbol of patriotism and progress, of a striving for justice and equality, a reaching out for liberty and light." Francis Payne Bingham was the fourth child of Mary and Charles Bingham. Grandfather William Bingham had made his fortune in hardware after the Civil War. Her maternal grandfather, Henry Payne, was one of Cleveland's first railroad tycoons. He had served in the U.S. House of Representatives before his election to the Senate in 1885, the year Francis Bingham was born. The Bingham and Payne families had helped to shape Cleveland's dynamic industries in the last decades of the 19th century. The city was a center for iron and steel production. Industrial titans like John D. Rockefeller, who founded the Standard Oil Company in Cleveland, gave Ohio political clout. Thousands of immigrant laborers seeking a better life swelled the city's population, creating a chasm between the worlds of privilege and want. The Binghams did not take their good fortune for granted. The couple carried on a family tradition of stewardship and community service. Mary Bingham started one of the city's first day nurseries for indigent children. Charles Bingham, a Midwesterner of unusual cultivation and taste, served on the board of Lakeside Hospital and the Cleveland Museum of Art. He had studied the classics at Yale and took pride in his extensive library of rare books. He insisted that the family speak German at the dinner table. Frances grew up keenly aware of the obligations her birthright entailed. She recalled her father's reaction after she made an accounting of how she had spent her weekly allowance. He said to me with mustaches drooping, "A storm signal for us all. Yes, the arithmetic is correct, my dear, but I'm sorry to see that you have spent it all on yourself." She never forgot her father's lesson, that with privilege must come responsibility. Frances Bingham grew up on fashionable Euclid Avenue at number 611. She was named after Frances Payne, a maiden aunt exiled to Cleveland after her puritanical father caught her reading the heretical works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. This independence may have left a strong impression on Frances. A moody child, Frances Bingham envied her older sister Betty's easy charm and resented her sister's hand-me-down. Charles Bingham expected his daughters to play in their dollhouse, but like her namesake, Frances preferred spending her time reading in her father's vast library.
Her father must have been quite an intellectual, and he had an interesting library. He never put a book on a shelf until he had read it. Apparently it was stacked up on the floor. But I remember her saying that she even read Schopenhauer. And she would stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning and put towels underneath her door so that no one would see that the light was burning and she was still up. She wanted knowledge.
Worry over the precarious health of their eldest son, Oliver, preoccupied the family. To shield this frail child from the rigors of Cleveland's winters, the family spent several months each year at Figulus, the family's home in Palm Beach, Florida. Winters at Figulus interrupted Frances and Betty's schooling at Hathaway Brown's School for Girls. Unlike the boys in the family, whose education continued in Florida, the 2 girls were left to fend for themselves. My brothers had a tutor, a Yale man with a scroll and key and all that business, but nobody cared what the little girl learned. Frances often found herself alone. She became introspective and independent. Down there, it was far more exciting to watch buzzards, rattlesnakes, and alligators by day, and the great and infinite heavens by night. Finding the orthodox explanations of visible and invisible life too restricting, I started off from that same beach to find paths more suited to my own understanding. Her mother died at Figulus when Frances was just 12 years old. Later in life, reflecting on this loss, Frances said,
When I was but 12, death entered my life. The dear old rector of a nearby mission chapel took me on his knee and told me very gently that I must not be unhappy, for God had put my mother to sleep until the resurrection day. My revolt was immediate and violent. I slid off his knee and ran out the door to the sea beach, where I had taken all my child agonies. For there, God always seemed closer and more real than in any church. A flame of indignation consumed me as I shook my fists at the sky, calling out with all the passion within me, "That isn't true, God, and I must know what is."
Death revisited the family in 1900 when Oliver died of heart failure. It was a devastating loss to Frances, who was particularly close to her brother. Later, she wrote to her childhood friend, Chester Bolton, "Death changed me more than anything else could have. Sorrow cannot help showing one the serious side of life, and it comes to us all, sooner or later. I cannot explain why, but I am glad it came to me early." Mourning Oliver's death, their father sent Frances and Betty to Europe with a chaperone. This was the first of a series of trips that enlarged young Frances Bingham's perspective on the world. She regarded this opportunity to travel as essential to her later political career. Seeing the world with her own eyes helped make up for the gaps in her schooling. In the fall of 1901, Frances enrolled in Spence School, a finishing school in New York City. There she honed her leadership skills. "Dear Father, the Glee Club elections are just over, and your humble little daughter is president." Who ever heard of such a thing as my managing 31 girls? If they were men, it would be easy, but girls! The point is, what I say goes. Patience, tact, and self-control, not to mention kindness, etc. Won't I be a wonder? Shortly after the turn of the century, progressive reformers like Mayor Tom Johnson transformed the city of Cleveland. They created institutions to relieve the social distress caused by poverty, ignorance, and disease. Francis Bingham embraced the reform spirit. Elected president of the 1904 debutantes, Francis chose the Visiting Nurse Association as the focus of the group's volunteer work. Known as the Girls in Blue, visiting nurses served people too poor to afford medical care. They delivered babies and often took what in those days were radical positions on issues of birth control, domestic violence, and alcoholism. Their physical courage was legend. Fearing her father would not allow her to accompany the intrepid nurses on their rounds, Francis simply did not tell him. "I danced all night, had a very early breakfast with father, which flattered and puzzled him, then hurried off to my district. It was a whole new world, especially after my own sheltered one."
Bolton once said that a nurse was to her the individual who brought light, easement, intelligence, and understanding where there was darkness. And there is no doubt that her conceptualization of nursing was formed during her experiences traveling through the tenements of Cleveland and left her with a glowing image of nursing that stayed with her for her entire life.
In the fall of 1906, romance entered her life. She announced her engagement to Harvard-educated Chester Castle Bolton. They had known each other since childhood. Chester brought out a playful side of Francis. Anticipating his first visit to Florida, she wrote, "I am perfectly wild to see you, and muss your hair all up and laugh at you. You mustn't expect to be immaculate here." In September 1907, the couple were married at Harrywold, the family's estate in Bratenahl, where Frances had spent summers as a girl, playing along the shores of Lake Erie. Less than 2 years later, at age 24, she gave birth to their first son, Charles. Son Kenyon came along in 1912. That same year, Ohio suffragettes launched a campaign to pass an amendment to the Ohio Constitution giving Ohio women the right to vote. Like many women of her class, Frances did not approve of the radical suffrage movement. She noted in her diary, "And all this suffrage question. The fight is on for votes for women. I must bring myself up to date, yet I am out of sympathy with the pros and don't know enough to enlist myself with the cons. Why it is of such importance, I cannot see. I can only see new and increasing evils piling up should the ballot be granted to women." A generous trust set up by her uncle, Colonel Oliver Hazard Payne, irrevocably changed Frances Bolton's life. A reclusive bachelor, Payne had sold his oil refinery to John D. Rockefeller in 1872, becoming Rockefeller's partner in Standard Oil. He built a second huge fortune through the control of the American Tobacco Company. When he died in 1917, Oliver Payne was one of the wealthiest men in America. Frances may not at first have realized the magnitude of her inheritance and the power that it would command. In 1917, now a young woman of 32, she was preoccupied by the impact on her family of America's entry into the First World War. Chester, a captain in the Ohio National Guard, took a job with the National Defense Council in Washington, D.C. She had to cope alone with the birth of their third son, Oliver. The family's temporary move to Washington, D.C. brought Frances in contact with the nursing community's national leaders. They enlisted her to lobby for the creation of the Army School of Nursing to provide formal training for wartime nurses.
Bolton's work with nursing, particularly as she moved from a local to a national level, enabled her to develop many skills such as writing for publication, manage a budget, raise funds, give public speeches, arbitrate differing points of view, and argue her own point of view. It also gave her an opportunity to move outside the home and develop skills for which she would have had no other outlet to develop.
Chester insisted that Frances return to Franchester Place, the new home they were building in Lyndhurst, a working farm surrounded by woodlands and fields. While the large new residence seemed to depress Frances at first, after a few months, the family settled into a peaceful routine. Alone with 3 young boys and pregnant again, she wrote to Chester, "This is the most heavenly day you could possibly imagine. Oh, my dear, it is so utterly beautiful out here. I can't tell you how I long to have you here with me, yet how curiously unlonely I am. I am in the library. The men are raking gravel. The gardener is weeding around the pools. The baby is objecting to being taken out of his tub. Ken is dressing, and I trust the maids are all about their business. The quiet and the peace and the beauty of the place begins to sink into the marrow of my bones." In 1918, an influenza pandemic swept the world, killing more people than the battles of World War I. In May of that year, Frances contracted the virus. The couple lost their infant daughter, Elizabeth, who lived only a day. Frances's own life hung in the balance for several weeks. After the death of Elizabeth, Frances found hope in her belief in reunion with those who had passed away. She wrote to Chester, "Always death has been to me the curtain that lies between, necessary because our eyes could not bear the glories on the other side, but never impassable. And surely to us death cannot mean black darkness, for do we not know that our little girl is there? Never shall I forget the glory of her, the light that was all about on that morning after she left us, desolate but somehow glorified." Still grieving over the loss of her daughter, Frances, now 36, went to Nyack, a picturesque hamlet on the Hudson. Nyack was run by a self-styled Swami, Dr. Pierre Bernard, also known as Om the Omnipotent. A former circus acrobat, Bernard had strong entrepreneurial instincts that led some people to question his motives. Once asked by the New York Times if he wasn't more concerned with money than metaphysics, he is said to have replied with a smile, "I wouldn't care to say." Whether Bernard was a mystic or a charlatan did not matter to Frances Bolton. At Nyack, she took control of her own healing. She learned yoga and began to study the mystical religions of the Far East. She never returned to religious orthodoxy, and she continued to practice yoga for the rest of her life. She wrote Chester, "These people work on the perfect balancing of the human being. Oh, how I wish I might have had a start at this training long years ago. Plato, Socrates, or one of the others of those old boys, said, 'Accept nothing without examination,' and believe me, that is my principle. And if you go back in what you know of my inside life, I think you will recognize that strain, even as far back as dancing school days. Tell the boys I am getting a pretty good idea of standing on my head, and that I'll have some real circus stuff to teach them." Now it was Chester who was desperately lonely at Franchester. He implored Frances on many occasions to come home. She did not. Expressing his displeasure with the new ideas she now embraced, he wrote, "Your attitude of superiority in matters physical and athletic made me against rather than sympathetic to your work, and added to my dislike from whence it came. I also knew you were reading on things Indian, particularly in religion, and that did not help." She responded, "If the crowd at Nyack has come between us, it is you that have placed them there. I am no man's property, no, nor any woman's. I think I could live with a man, but I find it hard to live subservient to him. I do not yet know just what my limits are, just how much strain can be put upon the chains with which you wish to bind me, just when they might snap." The experience on the East Coast not only brought Frances physical and spiritual well-being, it also allowed her to build strong relationships with other women who were working to raise the status of nursing, one of the few professions open to women in the 1920s. At this time, nurses usually received their training in hospital wards, where their labor was grueling, their instruction cursory. Frances Bolton was convinced that nurses deserved a quality education. In 1923, she gave Western Reserve University in Cleveland a landmark gift to set up a separate school of nursing within the university. This was the largest gift ever awarded to a school of nursing, and created one of the premier nursing schools in the nation. Her gift had a key condition. She said the school should make constructive experiments in the field of nursing education. In 1935, the school was renamed the Frances Payne Bolton School of Nursing.
For nursing is to me the #1 service for women, not only in time of war when hundreds of thousands of men's lives depend upon nursing care, but also in peacetime, when the nurse is not only caring for the sick, but teaching health, and so laying ever deeper foundation stones for a world where the incoming generations will have sound bodies and a chance for ever-increasing joy in living, physically, mentally, and spiritually. And in addition, in making possible to our young women a constructive professional career, nursing training is the best preparation I know for marriage, homemaking, and motherhood.
She was truly committed to the elevation of nursing as a profession. Maybe she saw nurses as being in the vanguard of the movement for social change. So in a sense, helping nurses was a way of achieving her philanthropic objective of making society better.
Mrs. Bolton also helped the National Association for Colored Graduate Nurses survive the Depression by paying the salary of the executive director, Mabel Keaton Stoppers. Later, Mabel Stoppers would play a key role in the fight to integrate the Armed Forces Nurse Corps during World War II.
Frances Payne Bolton is helping a group achieve integration, and she is there during those critical years when funds are in short supply. She did not have the kind of racial blinders that was quite prevalent in American society at that time.
Mrs. Bolton's philanthropy always reflected a personal involvement. The Boltons supported Hawkins School, the country day school attended by their sons. Mrs. Bolton shared James Hawkins' belief that education should strengthen moral character. When the school needed to expand, the Boltons donated land adjacent to Franchester for a new campus, and they continued their generous support of the school each year. From her commitment to education in the 1920s grew her vision for the Payne Fund, incorporated in 1929. The Payne Fund commissioned some of the first scientific studies of the influence of radio and movies on moral character. Now regarded as pioneering contributions to the field of media studies, these publications were attacked by the movie industry. The fund also supported the effort to make English an international language. Mrs. Bolton funded social experiments whose outcome could not be predicted. She expressed the essence of the Payne Fund when she said, "It has been a characteristic of our family to want to try out something, to go on from one problem to another. So experiment always has meant much more in my family than helping out in established works of any kind." In 1927, tragedy again struck the Bolton family. A freak diving accident at summer camp left their eldest son, Charles, paralyzed. The surface of the water had broken his neck. His will to live and the caring of his mother enabled him eventually to walk with crutches. Coping with her son's injury immediately refocused Frances Bolton's life. To her father, she wrote, "There is just one thing in this world that is in my heart and mind these days and nights, and that is Charlie. Nothing else and nobody else matters to me just now." Emerging from the hell of Charles's tragedy brought her once again face to face with the mysteries of life and death. After Charles's accident, she sought to further her spiritual quest through a deep interest in survivalism, the notion that the human soul survived death. For Frances Bolton, life after death represented what she called the most mysterious and significant study in the history of mankind. With her funding and faith in science leading the way, she set out to prove the eternity of the soul. Mrs. Bolton pursued her quest with Eileen Garrett, the best-known medium of her era. In 1932, the Los Angeles Times described Garrett as cultured, witty, and juggling the mysteries of life and death in a downright matter-of-fact way. In Garrett, Frances Bolton found a kindred spirit. She frequently met with Garrett in New York. There, Garrett would drift into a trance-like state and channel wisdom from Uvani, an ancient Asian spirit.
She would just, through the breathing, somehow, get into this altered state of consciousness, which was rather like going to sleep, and she'd sort of nod. And then this character would, through her voice, say, "It is I, Uvani, I give you greeting, friend," something like that. And what is your desire? Why are you here?
During one session, Mrs. Bolton asked, "I would like to have the reasons for the unhappiness I had when I was younger." Garrett, as Uvani, answered, "You have been unhappy because it was very necessary for you to understand your own strength. You have given that you might get over the terrific pain, and so you have gone out into the universe of giving and doing and understanding." Did Garrett truly channel a spiritual entity? Despite her growing fame, Garrett herself was perplexed about her abilities.
A very famous quote of Garrett said that on Monday, Wednesday, Friday she believed in the hereafter, and on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday she didn't, and on Sunday she didn't give a damn.
Garrett wrote, If the whole strange, mystifying psychic gift could be snatched out of the darkness of seance rooms and put into the capable, probing hands of science, everybody would feel much better about the subject, and the world of science and philosophy could be enriched. For the remainder of their lives, Bolton and Garrett worked to win acceptance for psychic phenomena and parapsychology as a legitimate scientific discipline. They helped to create a parapsychology laboratory at Duke University.
The intellectual curiosity of these two women led them to delve into any avenue to bring some light onto the subject at a time when really this was a taboo subject. Through their contact, through their great friendship, I think they had to put this out in the open and clean it all up. That is what they did.
Bolton and Garrett set up the Parapsychology Foundation in 1953 to encourage further exploration of the psychic world. That same year, the foundation sponsored the most significant gathering of parapsychologists in the 20th century at the University of Utrecht in Holland. The conference was attended by scholars and scientists from around the world and triggered wider interest in parapsychology. The success of this foundation was of tremendous importance to Mrs. Bolton.
The last conference that was held with both Mrs. Bolton and Garrett in 1970, which I believe was the Foundation's 19th conference, she said at that date, "To me, the whole area of parapsychology is something that the future must understand. It is a wonderful opportunity to get together, to argue, to discuss, to say, I don't believe a word of it. All right, go ahead, have it your way. What is important is that we are here to discuss it and try to get at the truth and its meaning for all of us."
In seeking re-election to another term in Congress, I do so with a keen appreciation of the responsibilities and problems of the future. I have endeavored at all times.
Before World War I, Chester Castle Bolton had worked as an executive in the steel industry. In the 1920s, he launched a career in Republican politics. Frances regarded public service as a family tradition, and she heartily approved of this decision. He was elected to the Ohio Senate in 1926, where he was majority leader. In 1928, he successfully ran for Congress as representative from Ohio's 22nd District. The Boltons moved to Washington, D.C., where Chester became a leader of the Republican Party. He served on the Appropriations Committee and was considered the representative of the Great Lakes states on the Rivers and Harbors Committee. He sponsored legislation transferring maintenance of the Great Lakes harbors to the federal government. As chairman of the Republican National Committee in 1936, he played a pivotal role in bringing the Republican Presidential Convention to Cleveland. However, his preoccupation with the convention and his outspoken criticism of Roosevelt's New Deal cost him his seat in Congress. 2 years later, he won back his district, but the difficult campaign may have caused a fatal heart attack. Chester's death in 1939 precipitated Frances Bolton's momentous decision to campaign for election to fill his unexpired term. Writing of her plans to her sons, she said, "I think you know that to finish Dad's unfinished doing is almost a passion with me. It is as if some inner force kept urging me to see that not one thread goes untied, that the pattern of his weaving may rest upon the expanse of time with beauty and completeness. I am not the first woman who has had to be alone, who has had to re-find herself." In 1940, she won in a 4-1 landslide victory. As Ohio's first Congresswoman, Mrs. Bolton joined 5 other women in the House of Representatives. Her political rhetoric, mixed with influences from motherhood, Nursing and Mysticism, stressed her unusual preparation for public office. Nothing has ever really interested me except humans. I have worked in the districts with the nurses. I have washed filth from bodies, as well as from walls and floors. I have burned wells of midnight oil, studying the causes of human misery as presented in books. I have lived vividly with pain and with illness. I have given back to the invisible a life that came into being through me. I have gone across the threshold between the worlds and have seen the light upon the mountain tops, even as I have known anguish and despair. Such has been my training. In 1940, at the age of 55, her public life was just beginning, and the United States was on the threshold of World War II. While World War II raged across the European continent, political poet Archibald MacLeish prophetically wrote, "The great majority of the American people understand very well that this war is not a war only, but an end and a beginning, an end to things known and a beginning of things unknown. We know that whatever the world will be when the war ends, the world will be different." On August 25, 1944, the Allies liberated the city of Paris from Nazi control. One day later, French President Charles de Gaulle braved the remaining sniper fire and took his famous walk from the Arc de Triomphe to Notre Dame, signifying the return to power of democratic forces. The very next day, Francis Payne Bolton entered the city.
In 1944, I flew into Paris 2 days after liberation to discuss the food situation as it related to our transportation facilities. I spent some hours going into the shops to talk with the women. As I was the first woman into Paris, we had much to say to each other. In each instance, I told them that General Patton was pressing the Germans back so rapidly that we needed every transport facility we had to keep up with him with food, ammunition, and hospitals, and asked them if they could get on for another 10 or 12 days without additional food supplies. In every instance, the moment they understood the situation, they said, "But of course, Madame, we have managed until now without hope. What are 10 more days with certainty?"
How did Ohio's first Congresswoman find herself so near the front? At the end of an 8-week inspection of American hospitals in England, she convinced the military to bend their rules and allow a civilian into a military zone. Mrs. Bolton's unusual political clout came from her role in drafting key wartime legislation. In 1940, she had sponsored the Bolton Bill to address the critical shortage of nurses. The Bolton Bill allocated $65 million to create the United States Cadet Nurse Corps. It provided nursing schools with federal funding to educate 125,000 additional nurses for the war effort. The Bolton Bill had enormous social implications because it contained a clause prohibiting racial discrimination in nursing schools.
The Bolton Bill came to have the anti-discrimination clause to it because Francis Payne Bolton had for years been supporting the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses led by Mabel Stolpers. And Mabel Stolpers, as executive director, had as her #1 agenda item the integration of black women into the mainstream of American nurses. Frances Payne Bolton was working out of decades-long commitment to social justice and equality of opportunity within nursing. All of these forces converged to make this Bolton bill a model bill for his time, and certainly at least 2 decades ahead of some of the other bills that would be passed during the Civil Rights Movement.
Mrs. Bolton also fought racial discrimination in the armed forces. She served on the Board of Trustees of the Tuskegee Institute, one of the most influential black colleges in the United States. Before the House of Representatives, she made an impassioned plea to allow the Tuskegee Air Force Squadron to fly in World War II. After she prevailed, she said, "In the air, men must feel themselves as gods, or, like Icarus, they lose their wings and fall to the earth. The first squadron of colored flyers has left for combat duty, taking the hearts of Tuskegee with them." At the end of the war, Mrs. Bolton took numerous trips throughout Western and Eastern Europe as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She gave the first free news dispatch from Poland after German occupation. When the United States celebrated the victory over Japan, she was in Moscow, assessing the Soviet Union's future role in the post-war world. Her close association with General Dwight D. Eisenhower during the war later played a role in his future political career. America emerged from World War II as the most powerful nation in the world. Presidents Truman and Eisenhower cultivated the continuing prosperity, leading to what some called the dawn of the American Age. However, challenging this dominance was the communist leadership of the Soviet Union. Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev attacked capitalism as the embodiment of evil and the exploiters of labor. These deep cultural and political differences led to a polarization of the world into 2 hostile camps.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
Churchill defined what the Iron Curtain was. He brought the terminology into use. Mrs. Bolton thinks that the Iron Curtain is a very valid way to define what is going on in the world.
Moscow has forced us to realize that the world is still in a state of siege. The Soviets, during these 3 years, has extended its sway nearly halfway round the world and now rules with an iron hand 500 million human beings. At this very moment, her poisoned tentacles stretch themselves out ever more grimly towards the Atlantic.
The Cold War became an ideological conflict that Frances Payne Bolton played a significant role in shaping. She committed herself to understanding the Soviet mind and the expanding communist empire. She became an agent of the effort to preempt the further spread of communism, ease the suffering of nations, and strengthen the message of American democracy. In 1947, she traveled to the Soviet Union as chair of a 5-member House Foreign Affairs Committee, thus becoming the first woman ever to head an overseas mission. Her goal was to study world communism and the degree to which it was controlled by Moscow.
In addition to reports made after surveys of Europe and the Near East, the principal accomplishment to date of the subcommittee of which I am chairman is the report on the strategy and tactics of world communism. When I tell you that it is a must for reading in the armed services and the State Department, that 1,000 copies were requested by the British government, that copies are in Paris libraries being used by members of the French Parliament,
that our schools and colleges are basing courses upon the report and its supplements, I am sure you will feel it has been an important and timely contribution.
Strategy and Tactics of Communism is really a superb example of how many Americans thought that the communist threat was indeed global and that there was no limitation to the reach of Soviet-controlled communism in 1947, 1948. In many respects, the key event in this occurs in the early part of 1948, just as she's publishing Strategy and Tactics of World Communism. And in that, indeed, she notes how Czechoslovakia has just been taken over. Now, she knew this firsthand. She had traveled through that part of the world in 1945 and 46, and she understood, as she wrote home, that there were real problems in Czechoslovakia, that if the United States and the other Western powers didn't do something about this, that Czechoslovakia could swing behind the Iron Curtain. And when it happens in the early part of 1948, she can essentially say, I told you so. That this is an ongoing threat, that there are no limits to this, and that the Soviets will not stop at all from using brutal force in order to take over these countries.
Mrs. Bolton also fought the Cold War at home by supporting political figures whom she thought would enable America to remain strong. In the early 1950s, she accompanied Henry Cabot Lodge on a visit to General Dwight Eisenhower to convince him to run for the nation's highest office as a Republican.
The latter part of 1951, a group of us on the Republican side signed a joint letter showing this broad and deep support for his candidacy. Now that was very tough for Francis because Bob Taft from Ohio was also a candidate. Bob Taft was an outstanding senator, but I had reservations as to whether he could prevail against the Democrat. So Francis and I both took a gamble.
The Republican Party presents a united front following the bitterly contested 25th Republican National Convention, which saw General Eisenhower win over Senator Taft on the first ballot, 845 to 280. The two chief rivals clasped hands in a symbol of party harmony after the senator's announcement that he relinquishes presidential aspirations.
I will lead this crusade.
Mrs. Bolton fought the Cold War not only on a national, but also on a private level. One of many such individual battles concerned the Georgescu family in communist-controlled Romania.
Ligia Enrica Georgescu came to the United States for a brief trip, and the two children were left in school, and when the Iron Curtain came down, separation ensued. My brother and I were left in Romania. Eventually, the communists arrested my grandfather, and my brother and I and our grandmother were interned in what turned out to be a work camp. From the day my parents left Romania in the winter of 1947, my parents took every course of action imaginable to get their children out of the country. And in 1953, these two Romanians were approached by the Romanian communist government and asked to spy for the Russians and for the Romanians. And the payoff was the fact that they might someday see their children alive. They went to the FBI, and the FBI advised them, in fact, on only one course of action. Go public. Create a public furor, a scandal. Get the world enraged. And maybe, just maybe, the Russians would be embarrassed to kill the kids.
The only course left to us is to pray the good Lord that the worldwide public opinion will help protect them.
Frances Payne Bolton read that story, and then she assumed the additional role in life of guardian angel for the Georgescu family. Frances Bolton called my parents and said, "This can't happen. You're American citizens. I'm not going to allow this to happen." And that was typical Frances Bolton. strong, fighting for fairness, fighting for right. Dwight Eisenhower was a close personal friend of Frances Bolton's. And she went to Ike and said, Ike, you got to do something about the Georgescu children. This is just not acceptable. And so, due to her insistence, Eisenhower went to work.
Well, how long has it been since you've seen them?
7.5 years, practically.
When do you expect to see them, Mrs. George?
Tomorrow morning.
Are you going to meet them at the airport?
Oh, you what a question.
And because of Frances Payne Bolton, on April 13th, 1954, my brother and I arrived at Idlewild Airport in New York City.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for bringing me the good news, and thank you for everything.
But in fact, it was Frances Bolton who later, being concerned that I would not be able to finish my education, allowed me to be a recipient for part of my tuition at Stanford Business School through the Payne Foundation.
Peter Georgescu took full advantage of his education. When he stepped off the plane as a teenager, he spoke no English. Today, he is head of Young & Rubicam, a $14 billion marketing and communications company.
She would come into a room and she was electric. She was slight by stature, but perhaps one of the most impressive figures one ever can remember. I recall her eyes, the power, the strength, the vitality, the energy that emanated through her eyes. They could drill holes through steel. She was quite a lady. And yet, when you spoke with her, you sensed kindness. She was both a strong-willed person, and she was kind and gentle at the same time. She was a giant.
The Cold War led Mrs. Bolton into what would become one of the most passionate commitments of her life, Africa. For Bolton, reaching out for liberty and light was a global mission. While her initial interest in Africa was political, she soon became spiritually tied to the continent. There are so many views to give to this trek of mine. Where shall I begin? How should I find color enough to paint the pictures clearly, particularly when so much of Africa, like the mountains of the moon, is shrouded by mists the greater part of the time? Words are curiously inadequate when one attempts to write of this immense land, strangely mysterious, somber, lowering even, yet at the same time beautiful beyond the wildest flights of one's imagination. To drive through the jungles with great jacarandas flaming above, mahogany, fig, cotton trees towering like radio towers behind manioc fields. Mrs. Bolton strongly believed that the African continent was the ideological battleground between communism and democracy. 225 million uncommitted people, she said, can swing the balance of world power in either direction. In 1955, she embarked at her own expense on a 99-day tour covering over 20,000 miles. This was the longest trip ever taken by a U.S. representative.
I believe that Americans should know much more about Africa. After centuries of isolation, Africa is emerging into the world of today. The old symbols of European domination are giving way to self-government and new forms of cooperation. Africa today is on the march. Her people are hungry for knowledge. They are eager to learn
that they may be able to take their rightful place in a world where their capacities and their strengths, as well as their resources, both material and spiritual, may be fully appreciated. In very truth, Africa is emerging.
Everybody, you know, would know her knowledge of nursing and so forth, and her participation in great causes that she involved herself with. But I don't think ever enough was made of her love of Africa and the people of Africa and the poor of Africa. And she was a champion of those people from the day one.
You know, it's such a promising continent, and she could see its richness and the richness of the people. The wonderful thing about Mrs. Bolton was her interest in all the young people and how she wanted to know what their dreams were, what they were doing, how they were doing it. You know, she was so interested that she brought people out.
Mrs. Bolton spoke out on African issues even before her trip. In 1953, appointed a congressional delegate to the United Nations, she was also one of the first U.S. government officials to confront the evils of apartheid. On the floor of the United Nations General Assembly, Mrs. Bolton boldly attacked racial discrimination at a time when the United States was still a largely segregated society. She said, "The whole apartheid program of the government of the Union of South Africa imposes an inferior status on large numbers of South Africans by reason of their race. Fellow members of this young, inexperienced, and turbulent family we have called the United Nations, I beg you, with all my heart, and with the deep humility of experience, to understand that segregation is against the law of evolution." Mrs. Bolton also contributed to the cultural appreciation of Africa in the Western world. She used her personal funds to ensure that an Africa pavilion would be included at the 1964 World's Fair.
She is the person, as much as anyone in Congress, who pushes for the creation of a separate desk for Africa. That is to say, to understand that Africa is now becoming so important that it deserves a separate, specialized desk in the State Department. It should not be a part of the Middle East or the South Asia. She understands this. And as a consequence, for a person who started as a kind of traditional Republican isolationist, until she's talking about, in pretty sophisticated terms, Eastern Europe, but also a place like Africa, which interested very few people, but she saw what Africa was going to become and how important it was going to become. She anticipates all this. And I think the way she grew and the way she used her earlier education and her social status in order to do this is not only fascinating, I think it's almost unparalleled for an American woman in the first half of the 20th century to do these things.
I am Congressman Francis P. Bolton, again a candidate for re-election. Do you intend to vote on Tuesday? Your country and your president need your support. Let's all get out and vote on Tuesday.
Mrs. Bolton's 22nd district was the most populous in the nation. With Democrats outnumbering Republicans by a 2-to-1 ratio, winning votes took tremendous amounts of skill, persuasion, and energy. Mrs. Bolton worked tirelessly on behalf of her constituents. She sent them a monthly newsletter and employed the largest congressional staff in Washington, paid for out of her own personal funds. Mrs. Bolton loved to campaign, driving herself to picnics in the countryside, attending rallies in the bingo halls of the inner city, and greeting Republican presidential candidates during stopovers in Cleveland. As a Republican stalwart, she never let the party line interfere with her service to her constituents.
She took public office as a sacred trust. She felt the House of Representatives provided her with the opportunity to serve people.
In politics, I think she was very pragmatic. Her wealth gave her one interesting, I think, asset, which was that she couldn't be pressured or bought or intimidated because, first, she didn't need the job to survive. Secondly, she was above pressure.
She was a pioneer as a woman in the legislative process. And because of her prestige in foreign affairs, she was looked upon by both Democrats and Republicans as a very important person in the discussion or the debate on foreign policy.
With Mrs. Bolton, there was no question of total honesty, totally herself. And I think that I would have to say she's one of the great heroes of my life.
She never wanted to be called a congresswoman. She really bristled at that. She was a congressman.
She befuddled everybody. They didn't think she could do it. She kept being reelected. They never thought she'd last beyond one term. She was a total maverick, and yet she had the right clothes and the gloves and the beautiful manners. She went gracefully into ladies' teas, said the right thing, handled her teacup properly, but that yet she could go back into Congress and give a stirring speech. She earned the respect of her peers.
She legitimately criticized the Democratic presidents for their lack of initiative in civil rights. Eventually, they took action, but Frances was ahead of the curve.
Margaret Chase Smith pointed out something that I think was very, very important about Frances Payne Bolton when she said, Frances is able to subordinate herself to the goal.
Opinion in the Capitol is paying tribute to one of the most remarkable figures in American politics, and to one of our country's truly great ladies, Representative Frances Bolton, Republican of Ohio, who this week marks her 25th year in the United States House of Representatives. Senator Margaret Chase Smith, who served with Mrs. Bolton in the House of Representatives, is our special guest to pay tribute to her longtime friend and colleague.
Frances Bolton did a life work before she went into Congress. She brought up a family, she had her homes, and she did so much. And then at 55 years old, to go into Congress and run the elections, the campaigns that she has out
She's
there.
had some tough ones too, haven't you?
She certainly has.
Did you like politics as
No,
a
I
young
didn't like it at all. You see, the difficulty was that we had a son who had broken his neck, and he was desperately ill for many years. And every time there was an emergency, my husband wasn't there. He was up at the house or he was off someplace. So politics to me wasn't a very appealing thing.
Well, what convinced you then to get into politics?
Well, when he died, all the Ohio men thought I knew everything he knew and thought he'd brought all his troubles back home, which of course he never did. And they suggested that I finish out his term. Then I learned that they were saying amongst themselves that, of course, she won't stay long.
Yeah.
So being a woman, I decided I'd stay.
You don't have to do this.
Yes, I do.
Do you? Is there a compulsion?
Of course there's a compulsion about
is
it. Absolutely. I couldn't sit around and do nothing. And I come of a line of people who always served their country.
Yeah.
I couldn't possibly stay home and do nothing.
One of the great moments for women everywhere, in my estimation, was when a lady from Ohio stood before a great convention and nominated her friend from Maine. Seconded her nomination of a lady from Maine.
Well, I tell you, Mark, that was the high point of my life.
First woman ever to be nominated for the presidency.
Yes, and to have the privilege of seconding Margaret's nomination for the presidency, I tell you, it was the highlight of my life.
Down on the floor, they are demonstrating for Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine. Congresswoman Frances Bolton of Ohio is seconding Senator Margaret Chase Smith now.
Now the moment is here when a woman of very high order is presenting herself for the most important office in the land. Only the candidacy for the presidency, the top position in the hands of the people, could demonstrate to the world that not until women carry their share of the responsibility will there be peace and goodwill on the earth.
That was Congresswoman Frances Bolton of Ohio seconding Senator Margaret Chase Smith for the presidential nomination.
On December 23, 1783, George Washington watched as the British evacuated from New York City. This day signaled the end of the Revolutionary War and the liberation over colonial oppression. After securing the victory, Washington mounted his horse and rode all night to reach his home, Mount Vernon, in time for Christmas Eve. Once home, he wrote, "I feel now as a wearied traveler must, when a heavy burden on his shoulder is eased, from his housetop, looking back and tracing with a grateful eye the meanders by which he has escaped the quicksands and mires which lay in his way." Throughout the entire Revolutionary War, George Washington always kept the vision of Mount Vernon close to him. It represented what he was fighting for, the symbol of a free land. At war's end, while he sat amidst the pristine view of the Potomac, he knew his sacrifice was worthwhile. Of all Frances Payne Bolton's accomplishments, the one that best exemplifies her extraordinary contribution as public servant and citizen of the United States was her fight to preserve the lands opposite George Washington's home at Mount Vernon. At a time when communist and democratic ideologies clashed against each other, Mrs. Bolton believed that America needed to strengthen its own message of freedom and liberty. George Washington was a symbol of that message, and if our nation allowed industry to encroach upon his lands, our most enduring icon of democracy might be tarnished forever.
For many, many years, no one worried about that land over there. It just wasn't that valuable. But there came a time, as always happens, that the land became very, very valuable, and people were looking to put homes there, and corporations were trying to put businesses there. And two particular things were about to happen when Mrs. Bolton stepped in. One was the establishment of an oil tank farm, and the other was a sewage treatment plant. And when we look back today, we say, what could be worse?
She was not dissuaded by the sewage plant developers' absurd suggestion that conservationists shouldn't worry because they intended to construct the plant as a replica of Mount Vernon itself.
The view is really what everybody comments on, and it's what visitors comment on today, and it was what they commented on 200 years ago. The house is the way it is because of the view here, and Washington consciously designed the house to work with the surrounding landscape.
Well, you know, people often refer to George Washington as the indispensable man in our American history. I think Frances Payne Bolton, with regard to this view, was certainly the indispensable woman. There came a time when she just said, if no one else will do it, I will do it. And she took her own money and she bought the most important 485 acres. And from that, and it took almost 20 years to complete the process, we were able to save several thousand acres of this sensational view.
She was the kind of person that you knew after just talking to her that she was very special. You don't meet many people like that. I tell you, she did have an impact on me. I was scared to death of her one, and I kind of really never said anything in her presence until after about 2 or 3 years, and I began wondering what I could do for Mount Vernon. Maybe I wasn't the right kind of person. And I can remember sitting next to her one day, and this is literally the truth, and she said, "Dear, how do you like it?" And I said, "Oh, Mrs. Bolton, I think it's wonderful, but I don't know that I'll ever be able to do the right things for Mount Vernon." And she said, "My dear," she patted me on the knee, she said, "you will grow into it." And she said, "Don't you ever forget that I think this is one of the most important things I do outside of Congress." And she said, "You will feel that same thing."
Well, I think Mrs. Bolton's legacy is something that every one of our visitors see today. But I think in a more personal way, what she tells our board members today and our staff members today, and really everyone who loves Mount Vernon, is that one person can make a difference. I really don't think that view would be there if it wasn't for Frances Payne Bolton. And I think it's great to see in this world that one person can make such a huge difference with leadership and character and just hard work, and I think she's that person.
Frances Bolton's legacy of philanthropy, public service, and patriotism powerfully influenced her three sons. Charles Bolton inherited his mother's passion for medicine. Life as a paraplegic did not prevent him from participating in dental research and actively working to put the dental school at Western Reserve University on a firm financial foundation. Inspired by his mother's interest in international affairs, Kenyon Bolton served in the State Department and was instrumental in founding the Cleveland International Program. He also served as president of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. The Bolton Theater of the Cleveland Playhouse, a striking building designed by Philip Johnson, is a tribute to Kenyon Bolton's keen interest and support of Cleveland's rich cultural life. Oliver Bolton followed family tradition by running for Congress. He won Ohio's 11th district, carved out of his mother's original district through reapportionment. Oliver shared his mother's love of the flag. At the height of the Cold War in 1955, he introduced legislation to amend the Pledge of Allegiance, adding "under God" before the phrase "with liberty and justice for all." Given their status as the first mother-son team in Congress, in 1963, Mrs. Bolton and Oliver were invited to appear on the popular TV quiz show, What's My Line?
Now let's all play What's My Line?
And now to meet our first challenger. Will you enter and sign in, please? Well, I think that's Mrs. X. How do you do? And panel, Mrs. X's son. May I ask where you're from?
Ohio.
Ohio. Well, needless to say, we are not using the name in this case because we think it might reveal something to you. But I would like to present Mrs. X and her son, Mr. X, to the panel.
Happy to
Can
meet
you
you.
join me over here, please? All right. Do you know how we keep score? Yes. Well, that's fine. Then we'll let the audience in the theater and the audience at home know exactly what your line is. All right, panel. We can tell you that Mrs. X and Mr. X deal in a service and are salaried. And we'll begin the general questioning with Arlene Francis.
Are they both in the same business?
Yes.
Is it a profit-making business rather than non-profit?
No. One down and 9 to go, Mr. Cook.
Is it in any way connected with the entertainment world?
No. No, I wouldn't. It was in any way connected with the entertainment world. I wouldn't think so.
Some think it is.
But actually... But practically, we have to give you a no, Peter. I'm sorry. That's 2 down and 8 to go, Miss Newman.
Thank you. That leads me to believe it might have something to do with the government. Does it?
Yes.
It has something to do. Does it have to do with the federal government?
Yes.
You two perform some service for the federal government, am I correct?
Yes. Yes.
Do you go to people and tell them what you do to them? I mean, do you have anything to do with taxes? Do you have anything to do with the Internal Revenue Department?
The Internal Revenue Department, I would say no. Directly, no. That makes it 3 down and 7 to go, Mr. Gable.
Have you anything to do with the Department of Justice?
No.
No. 4 down and 6 to go, Miss Francis.
Are you elected to office rather than appointed?
Yes.
Is your position in Ohio a very large one in the state of Ohio?
I think that I could answer that and say that it would be considered a large position in the state of Ohio. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Would you be in Washington rather than Ohio when you are administering your services?
Yes.
Do you have anything to do with the Senate or the House of Representatives? I just got them in, the House of Representatives.
I think we'd have to, since this is a double question, you meant that all as one question?
I did mean it all as one question.
In that event, we'll have to say yes. Yes.
Are you both members of the House of Representatives?
Yes. Actually, the Honorable Frances Bolton and her son Oliver Bolton, both congressmen from the state of a congresswoman and a congressman
Yes,
from
I'm a
the state.
congressman.
You're a congressman. I remember once reading. Mrs.
I'm a
Bolton.
woman congressman.
You're a woman congressman. Now that got me got me out of trouble very nicely. But this is your
This is my 13th.
13th consecutive term, and Mr. Bolton has served 2 previous terms in the House and has now come back to the House again to practice his law in Ohio.
May I ask which party and if both members of the family are in the same party, John?
We are in the same party, and of course it's Republican.
Actually, Martin, the ranking Republican member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee is Mrs. Bolton. Yeah.
Well, that's a very responsible post, I must
Yes, and the most interesting one.
And they both have, in another way, established something of a record. I believe this is true. This is the first mother and son combination in the House of Representatives in all the history of our country.
I've never heard
John, is there another member of the family to match the Kennedys all the way?
Oh, we have several more.
You do? Well, then the Republican Party has hope.
It is so. Well, may I, Mrs. Congresswoman, Congressman of the House of Representatives, thank you very much. Lovely of you
So
to be
nice
our
to be here,
guest
Mr.
on What Our
Daly.
Line, on What's My Line. Thank you.
Frances Payne Bolton served her Ohio constituents with distinction, but her tenure in Congress was drawing to a close. A significant piece of wartime legislation for nurses, the Bolton Bill, carried her name. As the first woman member to head an official mission abroad, she had crafted one of the early documents describing the communist threat. She had served as the first woman congressional delegate to the United Nations, and was among the first members of Congress to recognize the strategic importance of Africa and the Middle East. Still vigorous at age 83, in the early morning hours after her 1968 defeat, her concession remarks had that same charismatic fire that characterized her career.
I want to congratulate Mr. Vanek because he has taken the district. I hope very much he appreciates that it is the end of an era, that he is starting something new, he thinks, and that I hope that the new era will mean to him something of what these years have meant to me.
Mrs. Bolton, could you sum up 28 years of service to your country and what it means to you tonight?
Oh, it's a little hard to do it in a hurry. Those 28 years have meant everything to me. It's been a wonderful, wonderful period in my life.
Mrs. Bolton, can you say why Mr. Vanek took this race as opposed...
Nothing that I would care to say over the air. You're quite welcome.
Do you have any words of advice for Mr. Vanek now?
No, no. And he wouldn't listen to me anyway. I'm nothing but a Republican.
Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. Thank you all. Everyone.
With the passing of her 28-year tenure in Congress, it truly was the end of an era. Mrs. Bolton returned to Cleveland, where she continued to be involved in many civic and charitable activities. When her dear friend Margaret Chase Smith lost her election in 1972, Frances Bolton wrote, "One does grow weary of it all. Of course, you and I both would like to go on if there was really a chance of bettering things, but as you said, things are so changed." In 1976, friend and colleague, President Gerald Ford, presented 91-year-old Frances Bolton with the Human Relations Award on behalf of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. The following year, Frances Payne Bolton died peacefully at Franchester Place.
She loved public service and exemplified the best of it. And over the chamber of the House of Representatives, there's chiseled into the ceiling the quote of Daniel Webster, which ends up, "Let us, in our time and generation, do something worthy to be remembered." Well, if ever there was a life worthy to be remembered, it's the life of Frances Bolton.
I think she is the quintessential example of fulfilling one's potential. Her legacy is to have taken charge of her life and put it to good use. Her legacy for women in America was to stand up tall for principle, regardless of gender. What a role model she was for women in America, in politics, in everyday life.
I think there's lots to be learned for my generation in looking at the career of Frances Payne Bolton, how she was able to work so effectively with so many different people. And she did it without appearing to be this hardcore, out-and-out feminist. She showed us how to use women's networks to achieve political office, to remain in political office, and to enact legislation that would help improve the lives of women. The Bolton Bill, the victorious fight to end discrimination and quotas in the Armed Forces Nurse Corps, was like the opening salvo to what would become the modern civil rights movement.
And now, this I believe. Here is Edward R. Murrow.
Congresswoman Frances P. Bolton of Ohio was elected in 1940 to fill the unexpired term of her husband. Her creed is unusual, reflecting perhaps her New England heritage of unorthodoxy. Her father's wonderful library was her playground, and she absorbed an inherited set of Emerson and studied the Eastern religions as well as Christianity. Out of a lifetime of activity and contemplation, Frances Bolton has distilled her personal philosophy.
I believe with Seneca that the end of being is to find out God. My search has led me to the place from which I can say with entire simplicity that I believe you and I are part and parcel of the stream of universal life, as water drops are part of the great sea. I believe that what we call a lifespan is but one of an endless number of lifetimes during which, bit by bit, we shall experience all things. I believe that we are responsible for our thoughts and actions from the moment the soul asks, "What am I?" And that once that point of development is reached, there can be no turning back. Made of the stardust of infinity, man has evolved, even as the stars and suns, as worlds and moons, out of the essence of God. Once started on his pilgrimage, begun in unconscious perfection, he will continue through light and darkness, through goodness and the negation of goodness, until in his own time he reaches perfected consciousness and is reabsorbed into the infinite being of the Godhead. This I do humbly believe.